New data from the Department of Education shows a noticeable drop in both history and civics test scores among 8th graders in the United States. Only 13% met proficiency standards in history and about 20% in civics. This comes about 6 months after federal test results showed the largest drop in math scores ever and reading scores at their lowest levels in 3 decades. Michael Petrelli is the president of the Fordham Institute at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and joins us now live. Michael, thank you so much for your time today.
It's great to be with you.
So, Michael, you look at these numbers and they are alarming. They're alarming for parents. They're alarming for the students. What is behind these numbers? Are we seeing lower test scores because of the pandemic?
Well, that's a great question, and the pandemic must be part of this story. Though the bad news is that these scores were going down even before the pandemic, especially in U.S. history. And so it's the pandemic, but it's not just the pandemic. So if we're trying to make ourselves feel better that, well, kids were out of school for a long time, they're still getting back into the swing of things, maybe things will turn around, we need to understand that this trend was ongoing, especially the U.S. history scores, which had been going down since about 2014. Unfortunately, we see a similar trend in reading where those scores were heading south even before the pandemic and then really fell off a cliff. Now, I mentioned reading because, of course, in subjects like history and civics, when kids sit down to take a test on history, civics, you ask them a question about, causes of the Civil War or a provision of the Constitution. Well, it's a lot harder to answer those questions if you're struggling to read. And unfortunately, we've got a lot of kids in this country, some of our lowest performing kids, where the performance has really been dipping lately. And I think they're probably struggling even just to make sense of the readings and the questions, much less the content itself.
Yeah, you look at these scores and they're just alarming, and you wonder, are these results really reflective of the entire country? I understand that they're national results, but are there parts of the country that are performing better than others?
Well, sure. I mean, there is a lot of diversity in achievement in America, just as there is in our country and in our schools. But look, these subjects, our kids do worse in these subjects than any other subjects that we test. And so when we look at these national scores, history and civics, 1 out of 5 kids proficient or even fewer, excuse me, that's a lot lower than we see for reading, for math, for science. And so that should be concerning. There are some kids doing well, but there's very few of them. They tend to be more affluent kids. They tend to be white and Asian kids. Again, these are generalities, but even if you look at the typical suburban middle-class kid or the typical white or Asian student, that typical student is not proficient in these subjects. So it's really quite widespread.
So the country has been dealing with cuts to education, teacher shortages, smaller budgets, really overall when it comes to funding schools in general. So what does the country do about this? I mean, how can the United States work to reverse this trend? Where are we going wrong?
Well, look, at least recently, I've got to say, we have not been cutting spending. In fact, the federal government has put in billions of dollars in new money to help schools catch up from the pandemic, as well they should have. And so we're in a period really since the Great Recession, so many years ago, where, spending did go down significantly after that Great Recession, but it's been on the upswing since then. Now, it's possible that these kids who were in 8th grade when they took these tests, it's possible that they did get harmed by the spending cuts way back when they were little, when they were in kindergarten or 1st or 2nd grade. Since then, things have been somewhat better. I think we've got to also look at what's going on inside the schools. I mean, you look at history and civics, and you ask any elementary school teacher, they will tell you that they feel a lot of pressure to focus on reading, writing, and arithmetic. And subjects like history and civics, they get to those if they have time. And if they don't have time, they don't get to them. And I think that's what we're seeing here in these scores, is that they just have not been a priority. I also have to wonder about what's going on outside of schools. We see a lot of trends going in the wrong direction for kids. And many scholars think it's related to phones, to screen time, kids staring at their phones all day. In the past, maybe some of that time they would have been reading, or they at least would have been outside playing, doing some of those healthy things. I'm a dad. We worry about this for sure. So, I think first of all, parents can keep saying, hey, we got to get the kids off the phones. And I think once kids are in school, schools need to do a better job prioritizing these subjects. And the sooner the better. We could be doing so much more, especially in the early grades, to teach kids about our country, about the great stories of our founding. When little kids, 5, 6, 7, that's the perfect time to introduce them to, all the great stories of American history. That's when they soak up stories from faraway times and places. And yet in many schools, we really don't get to that until later. And I think that's a big mistake.
Right. So you're saying that the problems lie with our curriculum, but I do wonder what's happening in other parts of the world. I mean, what do these results tell you about the quality of education in the U.S., especially when compared to other countries? Are there countries that we need to be looking at in terms of a better solution?
Right. Now, it's a good question. Now, to my knowledge, nobody else takes a test in U.S. history. I do worry that some of those other countries in Europe or East Asia maybe know more about American history than our kids do. That would be very sobering, but we don't know that. Look, there are other countries that certainly outperform us. Some of this is culture. You look at some of the East Asian countries, for example, there's been a long time a big focus on test scores to get into colleges and into the best jobs in those societies. That's certainly a factor. You've got some places where, of course, there's less poverty than we see here in America. That's a factor as well. But I think that the countries that do the best, it's not rocket science. They make sure kids are spending more time on these subjects that are important. They are challenging them. They're not babying them. They have high expectations, high standards,
right.
And the kids learn more.
Yeah,
and that works within our country too.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about so much of this, and you've raised so many good points. And unfortunately, we are out of time. But Michael Petrelli, thank you so much for joining us. Michael is the president of the Fordham Institute at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Michael, thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
Coming up next on Scripps News Live, Cinco de Mayo celebrations aren't complete without those margaritas, and some bartenders are no longer using tequila to make them. We're going to tell you about the new go-to spirit next.